Hello and welcome. My name is Carron Little, and I'm here today with Vanessa Dion Fletcher and Chels, our ASL interpreter. And we are this is part of our spring session of the Artist Focus series. I am I wish to share with you that I'm joining you from the ancestral homeland of the Council of Three Fires, the Adawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi nations. As an organization, we're very concerned about this the questions of ownership of land. Site, S-I-T-E, is in the title of our organization's name. And I want to reiterate something I shared last week. As I began to, as I started to organize Out of Sight Chicago, the public performance program, I observed that I had to ask the Chicago Police Department, permission, and I had to give a description of each performance that we were creating for them to approve the culture that we were creating in public space in Chicago. And this is in contrast to the public events that I organized in London, in the UK, where public space is mutually shared with the community. And so one just has to go to the police station and ensure that the site that you wish to do is available. So, these questions of liberty um, and ownership of site are very pertinent to our program and what we're trying to do. And the term out of sight is about, what the invisible. It refers to, questioning what is invisible. So as we invite artists over the last 10 years to engage with public sites, we've really asked a multiplicity of artists so that we have engaged in a multiplicity of voices around public space. And so it is with great pleasure that I'm here today with Vanessa Dion Fletcher, who has performed with Out of Sight since 2015. And we shared a piece that she did earlier on in our program, and I hope you take the time to review that documentation on the Facebook. Vanessa Dion Fletcher employs porcupine quills, wampum belts, and menstrual blood to reveal the complexity of what defines a body physically and culturally. Reflecting on an indigenous feminist body with a neuro-diverse mind, they create art using composite media, primarily working in performance, textiles, and video. Vanessa looks for knowledge embedded in these materials and techniques. The embodiment and visual art allow a reprieve from the colonialism and ableism of English. Their interest is in communication coming from the lack of access to indigenous languages, Potawatomi and Lenape, and as a person living with a learning disability caused by issues with short-term memory. This perspective of language and communication is fractured and politicized. As a Lenape Potawatomi neurodiverse artist, trauma is never far from the work. Sometimes it is subtly under the surface, sometimes it is at the center of experience and avert. With trauma comes resilience and care. And we're going to be delving in to a lot more of these concepts in the conversation. So welcome, Vanessa. Do you want to introduce the first video or shall we jump straight into it?
I'll just say hi, everybody. Say Kiha Kolomosi, which in Lenape means "Are you well?" I hope everybody is doing as well as they can be right now. And yeah, let's jump into the first piece. That was a wonderful introduction.
And, we would really like you, the audience, to share what Indigenous lands you're residing on, if you feel comfortable doing that in the chat. That would be really nice to have that warmth with us in the room. So this first piece is called Offensive Defensive, and it was a performance from Regina from the Queer Film and Video Festival there. So this next piece is a a collaboration that Vanessa did with Mar Serinya-Gou that we interviewed last week. Do you want to say anything about this video?
Yeah, the piece with Mar came about from your invitation, uh, and so I had not met Mar before, but we started meeting every week to just get to know each other and each other's practices, and yeah, I'll just we can watch and say more.
Oh, I didn't I'm having to juggle multiple screens here, so I didn't realize it popped up. Uh, thank, yes, and so this piece is called View of Two Worlds, is that the title?
Views of our world.
Views of our world. Okay, that is, I think, a nice place to stop. And the piece is very meditative, and I'm going to share the link to the video in the chat there for everybody to review the whole piece. I think it's about 20 minutes long. But I wanted to start off by asking you, Vanessa, a question about the materials. Because, in my introduction, I was talking about porcupine quills. In the earlier work, you were employing wampum belts. And I've also, when you did a performance in New York, several years ago, I think maybe 2016 or 17, you were you were using menstrual blood. So I wanted to ask you, you know, what, why are you choosing these particular materials? And I'm specifically interested in the more recent material of porcupine quill, and the history and the symbolism that is embedded in that material.
Mhm. So I started using porcupine quills around 2014. I was interested in them because they've been used by indigenous people across North America, including people from my nations, and they make really gorgeous work. So they were quills were used before glass beads to do similar kind of embroidery and kind of decorative practices on clothing, moccasins, baskets. The quills are harvested from the porcupine, and then they can be dyed many different colors. I have an example of a kind of digital print of quill work behind me. And in the second performance that we watched, I'm kind of demonstrating for the audience, right? Looking at the quills for myself and for the audience. So we're looking at them kind of through the camera, holding them, holding the quill, holding the porcupine hairs, and then I hold up a photograph, and so the photograph is of historic quill work from the Royal Ontario Museum here in Toronto. It's from that collection, and yeah, so quills. The interest is kind of seeing, seeing historic quill work, knowing its connection to beadwork, being really just kind of enthralled by the material and by all of the different ways that both historically and today artists are able to use and transform this material in so many different ways. And I find it continues to interest me, partly because there's so much variety in the quills. In North America, there's Eastern and Western porcupines, and they have kind of different, those quills have different qualities. And then depending on the age of the porcupine, the age and size, you have different qualities. And then there's differences between where you find them on the porcupine's body.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the second performance, you're really going into this. You're using the microscope, so it's a conversation about looking deeper and looking at the layers, and it's really fascinating to see the pattern, the invisible pattern that's embedded in the quills. And I wondered if thinking about technique and process, because you're also employing this as part of your visual arts practice and learning how to embroider with quills, and then this performance investigation that you did with Mar was really kind of looking deep into the materiality. Did that did have those two has the process of technically embroidering and the process of creating that performance informed your practices in either direction? And how is it making you think about what is invisible in our world?
I think I was so curious about what the quills would look like under a microscope, and I guess in a sense, it is kind of another world, right? To have a view that is so different from my kind of typical view of the world, and the quills, to see the patterns and to see the little barbs. When you work with quills, they're incredibly sharp, so you get poked sometimes, and to see what the what that material is, what is poking you, how is it catching your skin, I think I'm thinking about that because that's the kind of embodied experience of that comes with the embroidery practices. So being interested in both the visual art and the live performance side, I think about how I can share that physical experience, that embodied experience. And it continues to interest me and kind of propel my work. And I'm often thinking about the different ways that those two can be combined and inform each other.
That's really interesting because that actually leads into the question about language and thinking about you shared an almost the violence of the embroidery, this kind of pinching, and doing labor work myself. I'm aware of the physical toll it has on the embodied self. But in your bio, you talk about language being fractured and politicized, and how more recently you've really been incorporating that more into your performance practice. And I think about how this embodied violence that has occurred through colonialization, it becomes almost a metaphorical act within the process of you doing your work. Do you think are you, to kind of try and investigate what is invisible in your practice? I'm wondering if you can dive deeper into this idea of language being fractured and politicized for you.
Absolutely. The question of language, I think, relates, I think, through the material of the quill work. And then in the first example I showed, really connects to that work. So I'm using the quills in performance, and I put them in my mouth, and that's a reference to when you're embroidering the quills, they need to be soaked in water to soften them. So you can put them in a little bowl of warm water, or you can also put them in your mouth and have your saliva soften them. Typically, people use the bowl of water because porcupines carry a lot of diseases, so that's a bit safer. But putting it in your mouth has that reference to the embroidery practice. And so I would, fill my mouth so I can't speak with English with the way that I typically know how to communicate. And I, endeavor to have a moment of connection with each person in the audience by offering them a quill from my mouth. And it is a little bit, there's some tension there because I'm getting quite close to them with these very sharp objects. And then I'm offering them, something that's been in my mouth, it's been really close to my body and to my saliva. And I'm looking them right in the eye and kind of maintaining eye contact, which is another, form of connection and potential intimacy, or could also have people, feel really tense and uncomfortable, depending on, your experience of eye contact. But I really think about the ways that, English being my first language, it being the only language I speak fluently, it really being, in my life, a tool of colonization and oppression, and I'm often looking for ways that I can have moments where I communicate with people outside of English words.
Yeah, and I think the first performance you showed is a really great example of how you're employing these charged moments of interaction through this very simple act. But it reminds me, because I was a AIDS and HIV awareness worker at the beginning of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. And there was a lot of paranoia and fear at that moment about the exchange of, could you actually drink out of a cup that somebody who was infected with AIDS and HIV positive, had used. So there was a lot, and this fear, I want to say this fear and this disjuncture that exists when we talk about race relations, when we talk about, indigenous cultural heritage. There are, and when we talk about the colonized mind, the colonized body, even for, um, there is this kind of tension and this fractured. You use the word fractured and politicized in your bio. Can you, what are your thoughts on that? On how you're trying to kind of, it's almost as if in some of your works, you're educating the audience, you're bringing the audience in. Yet in that particular performance, you were really setting up the tension. And so do you want to talk about those reasons?
Sure. I setting up the tension. Um, it's titled offensive defenses because there's, I think, something um, very assertive about the action and my presence. Um, but it can also be interpreted as or experienced as generous and offering a small gift. um, I think it really depends on the audience's um, interpretation of those actions. And um, to talk about the words that I use in terms of the language being fractured, I think about um, my lack of access to my indigenous languages. I think about the lack of my access, the lack of right which exists because generations of Lenape children went to residential school, and that was after we were displaced from our traditional territory in New York in the 1700s. So it's been hundreds of years of um, negotiating how to maintain our language and culture and artistic practices. And then in my experience, I grew up and continue to have a learning disability. So in school, I was constantly being told that I was communicating incorrectly and constantly, failing at using language. And but was also aware that I didn't have access to my indigenous languages. So language has always really been something that I see as I see that it's not a neutral way of communicating, that it is can be very political, and that it can be very personal, that we have emotional attachments, and that there can be really deep and important meaning. And yeah, thinking about not being able to speak Lenape is, I think, a huge loss for myself and my community.
Yeah, because our language, or our native languages, really defines who we are, how we think, how we express ourselves. And I can really empathize with that, growing up in the or coming from the Scottish borderlands, where Gaelic was banned in the 16th century, and the Scots were forced to speak English. So this constant cycle of abuse and violence and elimination of cultural heritage, it is uh, um, is embodied in our individual existences. And I think, through your performative actions, you're um, creating a language about that disjuncture, about those fractured identity, the fractured essence of our cultural heritage, and the violence that was imparted. And I want to kind of delve into, because last week when I was talking with Mar about her work, she was talking about how her engagement in an action was a transformative experience for her. And I'm wondering whether, after your performances, and how do you, how, how does it impact your body? How do you feel after a performance? Is it a transformative experience? Do you feel elated? Do you have a physical, like, oh, I can grow my wings? How does it, how do you feel?
I get very nervous. So I feel very relieved, and I feel very accomplished. I do feel that I have taken something that's very important to me and really crafted it so that I can, in that personal moment, share it with other people, and that is, I feel, typically quite vulnerable while performing, and very nervous about it. And afterwards, yeah, so much relief. And I think, I guess I could say proud of myself for um, uh, taking those moments of vulnerability to share with other people.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, if you perceive the performative act as a means of um, building up your own confidence and maybe and overcoming the trauma, and is is it a pathway to actually confronting these ideas of these notions of uh, deconstructing the colonized mind, in the process?
Mm. Mm. I think, yes, to answer shortly. Um, uh, yeah, building confidence, um, I mean, I say in my, the statement, right? It's kind of a break. It's a moment of reprieve from, the way we're talking now. Um, and I think um, yeah, that embodiment and performance is, I think it's really important to um, practice, and just work in ways that are outside of spoken and written language, and to really recognize what, like, the richness of what we do have, right? Which is each other. We do still have porcupines and um, different materials and plants, and the um, performing and working with and engaging with these materials are a way of, I think for me, um, celebrating those connections and having fun. Even though it's scary and vulnerable, it is also fun, and sometimes more playful. Um, the looking at the quills under the microscope and arranging the papers. It is quite slow and meditative in the performance. That it is also comes from a place of curiosity and joy and wanting to think about what else can be seen, how can we play with and arrange different materials to make meaning.
Yeah, and I think this idea of building connections as well, with and seeing, breaking down the hierarchies within the frame of the performance, and that piece you did with Mar was really meditative, and even the sounds of nature we're seeing it in the background. I want to open it up for questions to the audience. So please feel free to type your questions for Vanessa in the chat. And we are streaming to Facebook, Twitch, and YouTube today. So please, wherever you are, we hope you can join in the conversation. And thinking about this idea of the playful, because I do think you're always, this is something that is a thread that goes through all of your performances. And you're really kind of this, and I've also been interested in how in Native American Indian cultures historically, there's always been a clown, and the clown was a person within tribal culture to really reflect and to resolve conflict, and to um, kind of to hold up the mirror to the issues. And I think there's a playful quality, especially in the piece you did that was in New York, for instance, with the menstrual blood. Um, are you thinking about are you thinking about holding up the mirror, and can you talk more about that playful quality that you're bringing into your work?
Mm-hmm. I think sometimes the playfulness is about humor, and that's the power of what humor can do in terms of play and fun, and also in terms of dealing with difficult subjects, challenging subjects. Is something that I observed and learned. Probably first within my family. And then I also think about playfulness in terms of maybe something that's kind of lighthearted, or really about kind of exploring in the way that might relate more to children. This kind of experience of play and discovery, which I think of as I do think about fun, and wanting sometimes, the work and performance to have fun qualities, and hopefully also that it's enjoyable for the audience. So kind of going back and forth between thinking about really serious topics, and also trying to bring humor and play into that work.
Yeah, and I think this is something that we've spoken about as well, it's like interjecting that moment of surprise within the score of a performance. But I want to bring in, there's a question in the audience from Mo. Can you describe your ideal experience as an Indigenous performer in collaborations with predominantly white institutions, structures, and platforms? So what are the structures that we need to create as white institutions?
Yeah, I would say that the ideal experience is to not work with institutions that are predominantly white. Um, I, I, um, I don't make I don't make work that's only for an indigenous audience, or is only for there's not a kind of specific or small audience. I hope that my audience is quite wide ranging. Um, but I do really value institutions and communities that have a diversity of people and experiences operating within them, and that have consciousness and accountability towards the people whose land they're on, towards building, relationships that will hopefully dismantle oppressive systems. And it's also thinking about, access and disability is also really important in who I choose to work with. So, people who and institutions who I know are going to support my access needs, and who are going to hopefully help me make my work accessible to as many people as possible. And what that means can also overlap with specific cultural experiences or experiences of disability.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to how you are thinking about working with materials as well. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the actual way we work as artists, and with the materials we work with in terms of collapsing those hierarchies, and wishing to work with institutions who are also collapsing those hierarchies and giving space to multiple voices. And this really kind of expands on a conversation that you and I have been having about trauma and the need for care and how and nourishment and growth, and I think these are issues that are facing marginalized communities across the board. And in terms of the more recent performance that you gave at the College Arts Association last week, you were um, you made a reference to digital and algorithms and how these and this is another form of language that is also fractured within our current society, politicized. And there's all these ideas of ownership and, the question of liberty and who has liberty and who has agency to participate. Um,
Yeah,
you
there's
know,
really a lot of work happening right now in terms of thinking. I mean, it's a really interesting connection you're making right between, an institution that maybe has a physical space and presence and working in those spaces, right? Whereas we could also think about, you know, the way we're watching right now, communicating with each other through Facebook and YouTube and StreamYard and Twitch are also institutions that are creating certain parameters around how we can communicate. And then, many, depending on, where you live, you might have really different and limited access to the internet. And, I know for many indigenous people don't have access to clean drinking water, and as a basic need, or don't have access to high-speed internet, and so communicating primarily through the internet is potentially a huge barrier.
Yes, and it's and that really highlights these invisible conversations that we want to really give space and presence to. And yeah, I want to. So, are there any more questions for the audience? I know we have Dimple and Stevie and Megan in the audience. So if you have any questions for Vanessa, please type them in the chat. I also want to just make a couple of announcements. So next week we are oops, oops. Next week we are interviewing Megan Mobadix for the Artist Focus series. And next week we have a program, public performance by so it doesn't allow me to speak and show an image on the screen, apparently. So these are the ways in which the space is controlled and how we communicate. But next, on this coming Friday, we have an out-of-sight curated program continuing our collaboration with Experimental Sound Studio, who have invited us to be collaborating curators in 2021. And we are facilitating a new collaboration between Rachel Bunting, who's based in Chicago, and Sheila Toledo, who is based in Switzerland. So that's going to be exciting. And Erin Pysert, Duff Norris, and Sarah Zalek, and Megan Mobadix, who's here with us today, are going to be creating performances, solo performances, and Megan is going to be collaborating with Ray Oppenheimer in Oakland, California. I also want to announce that we have various open calls for performance on our website. We have a public performance symposia that we're organizing, and in April 22nd to May 9th. And we have, and we're accepting proposals from you for live performance with Out of Sight. And we've also got funding for a public performance program this summer. So we're inviting applications from artists for those three those 3 open calls. So please check out our website that I will pop in the chat for that. And outofsightchicago.org. And I just want to return back to summarize the conversation I had with Vanessa today about her practice. We talked about the materials and the importance of materiality within her work, and using materials that from nature that hold symbolic meaning and history. Porcupine quills go back to an ancient process in specifically Lenape communities that existed prior to beadwork, and thinking about the relationship of embroidery with quills and how that's embedded in a performative embodied practice within her work, and how Vanessa's really exploring the collapsing hierarchies when she's thinking about the use of materials within her performance practice, and working in conjunction with nature that we also spoke about last week. And we had a very interesting question from the audience about the ideal experience for indigenous performers and artists to work in collaboration with predominantly white institutions, and how can institutions really think about creating space for multiple voices to exist both in the planning, the programming, and who gets to participate and who gets to present. So there's a whole plethora of rethinking and reimagining how institutions can function to support indigenous voices, and I would add to that, and Vanessa also talked about voices that embrace disability and create accessibility for multiple voices. So I want to thank you all for joining us today in this really exciting, this enriching conversation. And Vanessa, do you have anything else that you would like to add?
I'll just let everybody know I'm teaching a class with Kate Berry through the Abrams Art Center, and it's called Performance Art, Intimacy, and Taboo. It's going to start this coming Wednesday, so there's still time to register. And thank you to you and Out of Sight for inviting me to do this. It was really wonderful, and thank you to everybody who joined, and to our interpreter.
Big thank yous to Chels for being our ASL interpreter today. It's a long haul doing an hour on your own, so we're very appreciative. And Vanessa, could you just put the link to your workshop in the chat there? Do you have that handy? And yes, big thanks to everybody for joining us. And just to let you know that the deadline for proposals is March 7th. So we have, so you have a couple more weeks, and I hope you will join us on for our Friday curated performance at 7 p.m. CST with Experimental Sound Studio. That will be on Twitch. And please tune in next Saturday for the the Artist Focus with Megan Mobadix. So thank you again to everybody, and we look forward to the days when we can all be in the same room together. Thank you.